What would you do if the man eating cold porridge at your kitchen table, a man you had taken in from the road because he looked hungry and your mother had raised you not to walk past hungry things, turned out to be the man whose signature appeared on the document, threatening to end everything you had worked for? Not a villain, not a creditor sending agents. The man himself, in your kitchen, with your porridge on his spoon. This is the story of Iris Vane, 23 years old, the keeper of a small holding in the Northumberland Hills that no one believed was worth keeping, and the stranger who arrived at her gate in the rain on a night when she had nothing to spare and gave it anyway. What she found in the weeks that followed was not what she expected to find, and it cost her more than the meal, and it gave her more than she had been taught to ask for. Settle in. Let us travel back to the Northumberland uplands in the autumn of 1871, to a story about the arithmetic of generosity, and the things it returns to you in forms you cannot predict. Stay close, and let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from. The small holding at Crag End had been carved out of the moorland by Iris's grandfather, with the stubbornness specific to men who have been told a thing cannot be done and have decided to do it anyway as a matter of principle. He had drained the bog field, built the walls, brought in the sheep, and left the whole enterprise to Iris's father, who had kept it, and then to Iris, who had kept it harder. It was not large. 4 fields, a cottage, a small barn, a kitchen garden that produced more than it had any right to on that altitude and that thin soil, because Iris worked it with her grandfather's stubbornness and her mother's knowledge of what grew where and why. There were 12 sheep on the fell and 6 in the low field, and 2 pigs and a flock of hens that had never been formally counted because the number changed by season and argument. She had been running it alone for 2 years. Her father had died in the autumn of her 21st year, her mother 3 years before that, and there was no brother, no husband, no arrangement of the kind that the world expected a woman in her position to have secured. There was only Iris, and the holding, and the knowledge her parents had put into her, and the stubbornness that had come down from her grandfather through the blood. The village of Crag Fell was 1.5 miles down the track, which was 1.5 miles in good weather, and considerably further in anything else. The people there were not unfriendly, but they were the kind of not unfriendly that reserved its warmth for those it had known long enough to be sure of, and a young woman alone on an upland holding was a thing the village watched with the mixture of sympathy and skepticism that it applied to anything that might not last. It would last, Iris had decided. She had decided this the morning after her father's burial, standing in the barn with her hand on the neck of the oldest ewe and the rain against the roof, and no one in the world who was obligated to help her. She had decided it not from bravado, but from the plain assessment of a practical person who has looked at the available facts and found them, barely, sufficient. The land was hers. The knowledge was hers. The stubbornness was most certainly hers. What was not hers, and what she had known since her father's last illness, and confirmed at the solicitor's office in Hexham 3 weeks after the burial, was the ground beneath the east field. This required some explanation, of which the solicitor had given her rather too much, and the substance of which was this: 60 years ago, when her grandfather had purchased Crag End from the Belmore estate, the conveyance had included a standard mineral reservation clause, common in Northumberland land sales of that period, by which the minerals beneath the soil remained the property of the selling estate. In the normal course of things, this clause sat at the bottom of a deed box and meant nothing, because the Belmore estate had never shown any interest in what lay beneath Crag End's thin moorland soil, and had no reason to. In the normal course of things, the Belmore estate, it now appeared, had a new duke. The old duke had died in June, without direct heirs, and the title had traveled through the family's secondary line and come to rest on a man who had spent the previous 15 years managing a commercial enterprise in Edinburgh, and who had arrived at his Northumberland inheritance with fresh eyes and an Edinburgh-trained instinct for examining what an asset was actually worth, rather than what it had traditionally been assumed to be worth. He had commissioned a geological survey. The survey had found, beneath the east field of Crag End and the moorland beyond it, a seam of fluorspar of commercial quality and sufficient extent to be worth extracting. The solicitor in Hexham had received a letter from the Belmore Estates agents in September. The letter informed him, on behalf of his client Miss Iris Vane, that the Belmore Estate intended to exercise its mineral rights in the East Field and the adjacent moorland. The letter was correct in every legal particular. It was courteous in its phrasing. It offered a schedule of compensation that the solicitor described, with the careful neutrality of a man who knows bad news when he sees it, as nominal. The East Field was Iris's best field. It was the field her grandfather had drained, the field that fed the most sheep, the field on whose continued integrity the whole small arithmetic of Crag End depended. She had read the solicitor's letter and its enclosures in his Hexham office, read them again in the cart on the way back, read them a third time at the kitchen table that evening, and reached the same conclusion each time, that the thing was legal, and that the compensation was insufficient, and that the solicitor's gentle suggestion that she might wish to consult a specialist in mining law was the way a kind man tells you that you are in trouble, but that the trouble might be manageable, and that the management would cost money she did not have. She put the papers in the deed box. She went to see to the sheep. She came back in and made her supper, and sat at the table, and looked at nothing for a while, and then she went to bed, because 4 o'clock came regardless, and the sheep on the fell didn't know about mineral rights. That was the Tuesday. The stranger arrived on the Thursday. It had been raining since Wednesday morning, the particular Northumberland rain that is not dramatic but is absolute. A fine, pervasive, horizontal rain that finds every gap and seam and turns the track between Crag End and the village to a stream of thin, brown water. Iris had spent the day on necessary indoor work, mending, accounting, the repair of a cracked water trough that she had been putting off for a fortnight and could not put off through another wet season. She was at the kitchen table with the accounts when she heard the gate, which was a sound she knew like a voice, the specific scrape of it on the stone threshold. She looked out of the kitchen window. There was a man at the gate. He was standing in the rain in the way of a man who has been in it for some time and has made his peace with the condition. He had a coat, but the coat was soaked through and adhering to him with the defeated intimacy of wet wool, and his hat, which had been adequate for something milder, was sending a thin stream of water off its brim at regular intervals. He was carrying nothing. He was looking at the cottage with the expression of a man who is calculating whether what is inside is worth the asking, and has decided that it is, but is not sure of the asking's reception. Iris had opened the door before she had completed the thought to open it, because her mother's training on this particular point was so deeply laid it operated without consultation. A hungry thing at the gate. You open the door. He was older than she had thought from the window, somewhere in his middle 40s, with the look of a man who was normally well kept, and was not currently well kept, because the weather had overruled his intentions. He had a face she would have called honest if she had been asked to describe it, which is to say, it was a face that showed what it was feeling, without apparent effort to conceal it. And what it was feeling currently was cold, wet, tired, and something she did not immediately name that lived underneath those three practical conditions. "I am sorry to trouble you," he said. His voice was measured and clear, the voice of an educated man, which sat oddly above the drowned coat. "I have come off the fell track in the rain, and I have missed my way. If you could direct me to the village, I would not trouble you further." Iris looked at him. She looked at the rain, which had, if anything, intensified in the last hour. She looked back at him. "The village is 1.5 miles on that track," she said, "which is currently running about 4 inches of water and will not improve before morning. Come in." "I don't want to." "You are soaked through," she said, with the particular patience of someone who has already decided and is waiting for the other party to catch up. Come in and dry out and have something to eat and go in the morning when the track has drained. That is what is sensible. He came in. She put him by the fire with a blanket because the coat was unsalvageable until it had dried overnight, and she put the coat on the rack and brought out what there was, which was not extravagant: porridge on the range that she had made for herself, bread from 2 days ago, a piece of hard cheese, and a cup of the dark, strong tea that was her own preference and that she made no apology for. He ate with the attention of a man who is genuinely hungry, not performing gratitude but experiencing it, and he thanked her for each thing, as her mother had taught her to notice a person did or did not do, and he did. When he had eaten, he sat with the cup and looked at the fire, and she sat across from him with her own cup and looked at nothing in particular, and there was a silence that was not uncomfortable, the specific silence of two people who are not acquainted but have reached, through the circumstances of wet weather and shared warmth, a kind of temporary, practical ease. "You are alone here," he said, not a question, an observation, and a careful one, with a quality of apology for the observation. "I am," she said. "The holding is yours." "It is." He looked at the room. She saw him looking at it the way she sometimes looked at it, the way of a person taking stock, the accounts on the table, the mending in the basket, the single candle, the orderliness. That was the orderliness of a person who manages alone and cannot afford the cost of disorder. "It is well kept," he said. "It keeps itself," she said, "if you don't give it leave to do otherwise." Something moved in his face. That is a philosophy that applies to most things. "Most things," she agreed. They sat for a while longer. The fire settled. The rain continued against the window with its patient, indiscriminate persistence. "I am keeping you from your evening," he said. "I had finished the accounts," she said, which was true, and which was the whole of what she had had to fill the evening, and she said it without complaint, because it was simply the fact. He looked at the accounts on the table and then looked at the fire. He said, carefully, "Is the holding sound?" It was a strange question, not impertinent exactly, but specific in a way that strangers at kitchen tables were not usually specific. She looked at him. "Why do you ask?" He turned the cup in his hands. "You have the look," he said, "of a person who is managing a concern that is very nearly balanced and has been presented recently with a weight on the wrong side of the balance." She held the look for a moment. "You read faces," she said. "I read figures, mostly," he said, "but they produce the same expression." She should have left it there. She did not leave it there, because the evening was long and the accounts were finished and the rain was not stopping, and she had been carrying the weight of the solicitor's letter for 2 days with no one to carry it to. And there was something in this stranger's directness that invited a directness in return. She said, "I have been served notice that the mineral rights in my east field are to be exercised by the estate that holds them. The field is my best field, and the compensation offered is insufficient, and the legal position is sound. And I have a solicitor in Hexham who is kind, but who has told me, in the way of kind people delivering bad news, that my options are limited." She said it plainly, because that was how she said things, and because she had found in her experience that plain saying saved time. The man at her fire was very still. "The Eastfield," he said. "Crag End. That is." He stopped. She looked at him. He had the expression of a man who has heard something he was not expecting and is deciding, rapidly, how to respond to it, and the decision is not simple. "That is a specific and considerable difficulty," he said, and his voice had changed slightly, taken on a quality she did not know how to place. "The mineral reservation clauses in the old Northumberland conveyances were—" He paused. "They were drafted broadly, broader, in some cases, than was necessary or fair." "Broader than was fair," she said. Yes, that is a precise description. Another silence, but this one was different. It had something in it, a tension in him that had not been there before, that sat under his stillness like weather under a calm sky. "Who holds the mineral rights?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "Why do you ask?" He set the cup down. He looked at his hands for a moment, the hands of a man who is preparing to say something he has decided needs saying, and the preparation is a form of honesty. "Because," he said, "I think I may be better placed to answer your question than I have allowed you to know." The fire, the rain, the candle on the table. "Tell me who you are," she said. He looked up. "My name is James Alderton," he said. "I am the Duke of Belmore. I arrived at this estate in June, and I commissioned the geological survey in August, and I sent the letter to your solicitor in September." He held her gaze. "I have been on the fell for 3 days looking at the land, because I do not make decisions about land from a desk, and I came off the track in the rain, and I knocked at your gate, and you let me in and fed me." He was quiet for a moment. "I did not know whose gate it was until you named the field." The room was entirely silent. Iris looked at the coat on the rack, at the empty bowl on the table, at the man by her fire with her blanket on his shoulders and her tea in his hands. She said, "You have been eating my porridge." "I have," he said, "for which I am, in the circumstances, deeply aware of the—" "You sent that letter," she said. "I did," he said. "The letter was—" He stopped. "The letter was a legal exercise. I had a survey and a right, and an agent who understood the right and exercised it on my behalf. I did not, at the time of the letter, understand what the East Field was. And now?" He looked at the table, at the accounts, at the room that was the room of a person who had nothing to spare and had given it. "Now," he said, "I am sitting in the kitchen of the person that letter was sent to, and I understand what the East Field is considerably better than I did in September." Iris was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the fire. She looked at the accounts. She thought about the weight on the wrong side of the balance, and the solicitor's careful voice, and the 2 days she had been carrying it, and the way the evening had felt before the gate scraped, long and empty and too heavy to fill. She said, "Are you going to do it? The extraction?" He said, "I was going to do it. I am not certain I am going to do it now." "Because of the porridge," she said. The dryness in her voice was not hostility. It was the specific dryness of a person who is holding a complicated feeling at arm's length with the only tool available to her. "Because of the East Field," he said, "and because I have been on the fell for 3 days, and I have looked at the land, and what the survey calls a mineral seam, I now understand to be the drainage foundation of the better part of this hill, and because the compensation figure in that letter—" He stopped, began again. "The compensation figure was produced by an agent who valued the disruption to your operation, and not the operation itself, and there is a difference, and it is significant, and I should have seen it before I sent the letter, and I did not." Iris looked at him. "How did you come to be a duke?" she said. "You said Edinburgh." "I said nothing about Edinburgh. You said you had spent 15 years managing a commercial enterprise," she said. "Everything else I knew. The new Duke of Belmore has been in the district since June. The surveys were common knowledge by August. Anyone in Crag Fell could have told me the rest." She held his eyes. "The commercial enterprise was in Edinburgh." He was quiet for a moment. "It was," he said. 15 years. Shipping and trade. My father's cousin held the title. I was not expected to inherit. When the expectation changed, I arrived here and found an estate that had been run on convention and assumption for 2 generations, and the conventions and assumptions had accumulated into a number of situations that were, under examination, not as sound as they appeared. The mineral rights letter being one of them, among others. He looked at the fire. I have been applying the commercial habit of actually examining things to an inheritance that had not been examined in some time. The surveys were part of that. The letter was... He paused. The letter was the result of a survey that was correct in its geology and incomplete in its accounting. It counted what was in the ground. It did not count what was on top of it. Iris looked at her east field through the kitchen window. In the dark and the rain she could not see it, but she knew exactly what it looked like. The long, even slope of it, the good drainage her grandfather had laid, the sheep on it in the morning, the way the light came across it first in summer. She said, "What will you do?" "I don't know yet," he said. "I know what I will not do, which is to proceed on the basis of the September letter. Beyond that." He turned the cup. "I need to understand the land better than a survey tells me. And I need to understand what the mineral rights are actually worth, against what they would cost. And I need to do that honestly." "You could have someone do it for you," she said. "The understanding. An agent." "I could," he said. "I could have an agent tell me what the mineral rights are worth. I could not have an agent tell me what the East Field is worth. Those are different knowings." He looked at her. "You know the second one." "It is my field," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." Outside, the rain was easing. She could tell by the sound of it on the window, the slight softening of its persistence. It would not clear before morning, but it had agreed, apparently, to become less absolute. She stood and went to the range and put more water on for tea, because it was what she did in the evenings, and the evening was not yet finished, and she was not, as yet, sure what to do with any of what had just been said, and the kettle at least was straightforward. "You can sleep in the barn," she said. "It is dry, and there is straw, and it is warmer than the fell tonight." He looked at her. "Miss Vane, you came off the track in the rain," she said. "That has not changed. The track is still running 4 inches of water, and the morning is some hours away. Go to sleep, and we will speak more clearly in the morning, when I have had time to think, and you are not wearing my blanket." A very long pause. "Thank you," he said. The 2 words carried more than 2 words usually carry, and she heard what was in them, and did not respond to it, because she was not yet ready to respond to it, and she was a person who did not respond to things she was not ready for. She showed him to the barn. She gave him a second blanket and the lantern. She went back to the kitchen and sat at the table with the accounts in front of her and looked at them for a long time without seeing them. In the morning, she thought, she would know what she thought about all of it. In the morning, she would find out what kind of man he was when he was not dripping on her hearth. He was still there in the morning. She had not been certain he would be, or certain she wanted him to be, and the uncertainty of both had kept her company through most of the night. He was in the barn when she went out at 4 to see to the animals, awake and already sitting up in the straw, and he looked at her in the early dark and said, "What needs doing?" She looked at him. "Can you move sheep?" "I have moved sheep in Edinburgh," he said, "which is not the same as here, but the principle is similar." "The principle is identical," she said. "Come on." They moved the fell sheep to the low field, which wanted doing, regardless of what else the morning held, because the rain had softened the upper fell, and the ground was no place for sheep in the dark. She showed him what she needed, and he did it, not perfectly, but adequately, and adequately from a man who had told her he knew nothing was more useful than perfectly from a man who pretended to know more than he did. They came back to the kitchen at 6:30, and she made eggs and more bread, and they ate at the table in the gray morning light, and it was different from the night before. The rain had stopped. The lantern was out. The coat on the rack was dry. He looked, she thought, different in the morning, less defended. The directness that had been there the night before was still there, but it had less weight in it now, or she had more capacity to carry it, or both. She said, "Tell me what the geological survey actually found." "Not the agent's summary, the actual report," he told her. He had, it turned out, read the report himself, rather than relying on the summary. which was consistent with the Edinburgh habit he had described. He told her the depth of the seam, the estimated quality, the extent. He told her what the projected extraction would require in terms of surface disruption and how long the extraction would take. He told her the estimated commercial value. She listened. She asked specific questions. He answered them. When he had finished, she said, "The seam does not extend under the whole east field. It is the northern quarter and the adjacent moorland." "Correct," he said. "The northern quarter is the poorest quarter of the field. The drainage is from the south. The sheep use the south 3/4. He looked at her. "If the extraction were limited to the northern quarter and the moorland beyond," she said, "with proper reinstatement of the drainage afterward." She stopped, began again. The field would be diminished but not destroyed. The sheep could continue on the remainder. The impact on the holding would be significant but survivable, with adequate compensation. He said, "What would adequate compensation be?" She told him. She had been thinking about it since 4 o'clock, because she was a person who thought through problems in the time that was available for thinking, and the time between the barn and the low field and back had been long enough for the outline of an answer. He listened to the figure she named, and he did not flinch, and he did not negotiate, and she noted both. "That is a fair figure," he said. "It is the figure that makes the holding whole," she said, "not more." The figure in the September letter was the figure that made the extraction cheap. "I know," he said. He said it with the specific quality she was beginning to recognize as his, acknowledgement without performance. "I will have it drawn up correctly. Not through the agent. My solicitor in Hexham, directly." She looked at him across the table and thought about the September letter and the 2 days she had carried it, and the rain, and the gate, and the porridge. "You would have done it anyway," she said. "If you had not come off the track at my gate, you would have surveyed and extracted and paid the agent's figure and moved on." "I would have done it legally," he said. "Whether I would have done it justly." He was quiet. "I would not have known the difference between the two. That is the honest answer." She held the look. "I walked the fell," he said, "because I believe that you cannot manage land you have not walked. But I walked it as the Duke, and not as the person being managed. And the knowing that comes from walking as the Duke is not the same knowing that comes from eating porridge in the kitchen." He looked at the table. "Your grandfather built this. You can tell me what it cost to build it, and what it costs to keep, and what it would cost to lose it, in a way that no survey can tell me, because a survey measures the ground and not the life on it." Iris was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather drained that field himself," she said. 40 years ago, he said the neighbors told him it couldn't be done, and he said he'd done harder, and he did it." She looked at the window. "He said the thing about Northumberland land is that it gives nothing for nothing. You put the work in and it gives you back the measure of the work, and if you cheat it, it knows, and it gives you less." She looked back at him. "That is my East Field," she said. 40 years of honest dealing. And the northern quarter is the poorest because it was the hardest to drain, and he gave it less, and it gave him back less, and that is the whole accounting." He said nothing for a long moment. "The northern quarter," he said finally, "is where the seam is best." "I know," she said. "It is the ground that gave the least to him. Perhaps it kept something else." The morning was fully light now, thin and clean after the rain, the fell visible through the window, the walls running dark, and the ground below them still shining with wet. She thought about her grandfather draining the bog in defiance of the neighbors' opinions, and her mother, in this kitchen, knowing the name of every plant on the fell, and her father dying in the autumn and leaving her the whole accounting. She said, "The compensation needs to include the reinstatement. Full reinstatement of the drainage after the extraction to the original specification, not approximately. The original specification." "Agreed," he said. "With a bond held by my solicitor against the completion of the reinstatement." "Agreed." She looked at him. You are agreeing very readily. You are asking for what is right, he said, not for more than what is right. I have dealt with people who ask for more than what is right, and it is a different negotiation. He picked up the cup. You are asking me to leave the field as I found it. That is not unreasonable. It is what my grandfather built, she said. I want it back. You will have it back, he said. That is a promise made at a kitchen table, which is where I am told the real ones are made. She almost smiled. She did not quite smile, because she was not yet done being careful, and being careful had served her well enough that she was not about to stop. I will want it in writing, she said. You will have it in writing, he said, within the fortnight, through the solicitor and through me. He left after breakfast. The track had drained enough by 8 for a man in good boots, and he had good boots. She gave him the rest of the bread because the walk to the village was long on an empty stomach, and he took it with the same directness with which he took everything, without performance or excessive thanks. At the gate he turned. I am going to walk the fell again, he said, from the other side. I want to understand the drainage from the source. He looked at the east field. Would you? He stopped. Would you be willing to show me the field as it stands? The drainage, the condition of it, the northern boundary. I can read a survey. I cannot read it the way you read it. She looked at him. Come back at 2, she said. The morning has its own work. He came back at 2. She walked him through the east field, from the southern gate to the northern wall, and she showed him the drainage channels her grandfather had cut, and the way the water moved through them in wet weather, and the difference between the south ground, dark and productive, and the north ground, thinner, lighter in color, less given. She showed him the boundary marker, a rough stone set in the wall with her grandfather's initials cut in it, because her grandfather had been the kind of man who marked his work with his name. He walked beside her and looked at everything she showed him and asked the right questions, and some of the questions were questions she had not thought to ask herself, and she answered what she could and told him plainly when she did not know, and he received the not knowing the same way he received the knowing, without hierarchy. At the northern boundary he crouched and looked at the ground the way she had seen surveyors look at it, with the attention of someone reading, and then he looked up at her. Your grandfather did remarkable work, he said. The drainage at this angle, on this ground. He shook his head. Most men would have given up at this quarter and taken the loss. He did not give up at things, she said. No, he said. I can see that. He stood. He looked at the cut initials in the boundary stone. I will not destroy this, he said. That is separate from the legal undertaking. I want you to know it is my intention and not merely my obligation. She looked at him in the October light on the Northumberland fell, and she thought about intentions and obligations and the difference between them, which was real and which her grandfather would have recognized immediately. I know the difference, she said. I thought you might, he said. The fortnight he had promised became 12 days. The letter from his solicitor was exact and complete. The limited extraction, the compensation at the figure she had named, the reinstatement bond held by her solicitor in Hexham, the specification of full drainage restoration. It was everything she had asked for, in language that could not be argued with, because it had been drafted by a man who had been told to draft it as though the person on the other side was as well advised as the person on his own side, which was not how estate letters were usually written. She read it at the kitchen table and read it again, and then wrote a short letter to her solicitor, who wrote back within 2 days with the expression, rendered in careful legal phrasing, of a man who has been expecting a fight and has found instead a settlement, and is not entirely sure what to do with the relief. She wrote to the Duke. Mr. Alderton, the letter is satisfactory in all particulars. My solicitor has confirmed the bond arrangement and will hold it as specified. The east field will be available for survey from November, as discussed. I would ask that the extraction schedule account for the lambing season, which runs February through April, and that the machinery be routed from the north gate and not through the main field. The bread was from 2 days before, which I should have mentioned. I hope it was still adequate. IV. She had added the last line and immediately considered removing it and had left it because it was true, and it was also the kind of small, dry honesty that was better in than out, and she was not a person who removed things from letters because she was afraid of how they would land. His reply came by return. Miss Vane? The terms are agreed. The lambing season will be respected in full, and the route from the north gate is workable. I have told the survey team accordingly. The bread was very good. 2 days made no difference. I will come to Crag End in November to walk the north quarter with the survey team, if you will permit it. I would prefer to be there when the assessment is made, rather than to receive it afterward. That is not a legal requirement. It is a preference. I have also been thinking about the boundary drainage on the western fell, which appears from the estate map to connect to your field drainage at the upper course. I believe the estate's maintenance of the upper course has been insufficient, and that this has been adding to your drainage burden at the north quarter for some years. I would like to have this looked at. If it is as I think, the estate owes you a repair. J.A. She folded the letter and put it with the September letter in the deed box, and the November letter was different from the September letter in every particular except the address. November came. He came with it, on the appointed day, with the survey team and his own surveyor from Hexham, a woman named Tate, who had the look of a person who had been underestimated professionally for decades and had decided to find it useful rather than otherwise. Iris showed them the field as she had showed him in October, and the survey team did their work, and she watched it done without anxiety, because the bond was in place and the specification was in writing, and the anxiety had somewhere to put itself that was not her chest. At the end of the day he walked the upper drainage course with her, where it ran along the western fell above the field. They walked it in the thin November light, and he showed her what he thought, and she showed him what she knew, and Tate came behind them with her notebook and said nothing except when she was asked, and then said what was correct. The upper course was blocked. It had been blocked by the evidence of the accumulated silt for approximately 10 years, which meant that for 10 years the water that should have been carried away above the field had been adding to the north quarter's drainage burden. The north quarter, which had always been the poorest quarter, had been fighting the estate's neglect for a decade, as well as its own thin soil. He looked at the blocked course for a long time without speaking. She waited. "This is older than the survey," he said. "This is nothing to do with the mineral rights. This is maintenance not done." "I know," she said. "For 10 years. Yes." He turned and looked at the fell, the long, gray, honest sweep of it, the walls running dark, and the sheep on the lower ground, and the field below them, its northern quarter thin and light and less giving, fighting a battle it had not been told it was fighting. "This will be repaired," he said. "Fully and properly. It is not part of any agreement. It is the estate's obligation to maintain the upper courses, and it has not been maintained, and the cost of that has been yours to carry." He looked at her. "I will have Tate specify the repair, and it will be done before winter." She said, "You did not know." "I did not know," he agreed. "I should have known. That is a different thing." He looked at the blocked course. "I have been an Edinburgh businessman with an estate I inherited in June, and have been managing at the length of a desk and a survey report, and the length of a desk is too long to manage land." He turned and looked at her directly. "I am learning this at your expense, which is not a satisfactory arrangement and which I intend to correct." Iris looked at the upper course. She thought about 10 years of extra burden on the north quarter, the thin soil fighting the estate's neglect on top of its own character. never given a chance to be what it might have been. "Repair it," she said, "and keep it repaired. That is all I need from the estate. Not grace and not generosity, just the maintenance of the course." "You will have it," he said. They walked back down the fell in the November dusk, Tate ahead of them with her notebook, and the valley below was beginning to show its lights, the village and the farms and the long dark road between them, and Crag End on its rise with its single window lit by the lamp she had left on. He looked at the lit window. "Your grandfather built well," he said, "on difficult ground, with insufficient encouragement, and it has held." He said, "The ground gives back the measure of the work," she said. "I said that before." "You did," he said. "I have been thinking about it since." She looked at the lit window. She thought about the measure of the work, and what the North Quarter might give back if it were relieved of the extra burden it had been carrying, and what it might become with full drainage restored and the upper course maintained, and 60 years of her family's honest dealing in the soil. "Come in for supper," she said. "Tate, too. The track is better now than in October, but it is a long walk to the village, and it will be dark in an hour." He looked at her, and the directness in his face had something in it she recognized because she had seen it in her own face. In the rare occasions she had the chance to see herself clearly, the expression of a person who is receiving something they had not expected and is deciding whether to let it matter. He let it matter. "Thank you," he said. They went in. The winter came, and the repair of the upper drainage course was done before it, quickly and to the correct specification, by two men sent from the estate who knew their work and did it without requiring supervision. Iris watched them do it and thanked them and went back to her own work, and the winter rain fell and the upper course carried it away, and the north quarter of the east field, for the first time in 10 years, drained as it had been designed to drain. It was a small change. The field looked the same. The sheep did not notice. But Iris noticed in the way she noticed everything about the ground, and the noticing was a quiet satisfaction that sat alongside the other quiet satisfactions of the season. The barn roof holding, the sheep in good condition, the accounts that had, with the settlement and the rent adjustment that accompanied it, moved from barely sufficient to something with a margin. A margin was a new thing at Crag End. She was not sure what to do with it at first, and then she knew exactly. She spent it on the seed she had been putting off for 3 years, the better variety of ryegrass for the south field, the one that would establish slow and last long and give back double what the cheap seed gave back in 5 years. Her grandfather's philosophy applied to the only spare farthing she had ever had. He came in December, as he had come in November, and in January, and in February when the lambing started, because she had mentioned the lambing in her letter, and he appeared to have noted it, and appeared, when he arrived, to have come prepared to be useful rather than to observe. He was useful. She showed him what was needed, and he did it, not perfectly, as she had noted before, but adequately, and with the specific improvement of a person paying attention and not pretending to know more than they had learned. By the second morning of the lambing, he was more than adequate. She did not tell him so, and he did not ask, but she saw him register his own competence in the way people register things they have worked for, with the particular satisfaction of earned knowledge. They talked, in the intervals that lambing allowed for talking. They talked about the estate and about the fell and about what she had observed in 10 years of managing the holding and what he had learned in 6 months of walking it. They talked about Edinburgh and about her grandfather and about the specific problem of managing land you have inherited against the problem of building land you have chosen, and the difference between those two relationships with the ground. They were not easy conversations. They were the conversations of two people who said what they thought and expected the other person to say what they thought back, and the thinking was sometimes different, and the difference had to be argued through to whatever truth was on the other side of it. She liked the arguing. She had not known she had missed it. In March, he said, I am going to be in the district for the foreseeable, not visiting, living. I have been managing the estate from a distance, and I have established, over the winter, that managing from a distance does not work. I need to be on the ground. You could have established that in June, she said. I could have, he said. I needed the winter to be sure. She looked at him across the kitchen table, with the accounts between them, and the morning light on the fell through the window, and the sounds of the ewes in the barn. Then you will need to know the fell, she said. Not from walking it once. From walking it in all the weather. I know, he said. I am hoping. He stopped in the way he sometimes stopped, at the edge of something, with the care of a man who does not say the thing until he is sure of it. I am hoping to learn it the right way, from someone who knows it. She looked at him. I know the fell, she said. I know you do, he said. That is what I mean. She held the look for a long moment. She thought about the September letter, and the October night, and the measure of the work, and the North Quarter draining clean for the first time in 10 years. She thought about a man who walked his own land in a soaked coat in the rain, and came off the fell track at her gate, and ate her porridge, and admitted what he had done wrong, and fixed what he could fix, before she asked him to, and came back in November, and in December, and in January, and through the lambing, and was still at her kitchen table in March, with the accounts between them, and the morning light on the fell. She thought about her grandfather's philosophy. The ground gives back the measure of the work. She had been putting the work in for a long time, in cold seasons and thin ones, alone and without margin, and without the comfort of being certain it would hold. This was what it gave back. After the lambing, she said, when the fell is dry, I will show you the whole of it. Every field, and every drain, and every wall, and every corner of it, from the south boundary to the northern edge. He said, I will be here. I know, she said, and she did know, with the same knowledge she had for the field and the drainage and the seasons, the knowledge that is not hoped for but read, from the evidence of the thing itself, honestly and without what she wished it to say. He was there. They were married in the autumn, in the church at Crag Fell, in the plain and practical manner of two people who have agreed on all the things that matter and find the ceremony a welcome formality. The village came because the village comes to such things, and because the story had been the village's story in the way that good stories become the property of the place they happen in. The duke who came off the fell in the rain, and the woman at Crag End who let him in and set him straight, and what became of it, and how the estate was better for it, and the holding was better for it, and the North Quarter drained as it had not drained in 10 years. The East Field extraction was completed the following spring, carefully and to the specification, and the reinstatement was done before summer, the drainage restored to the original design. She walked it the day the last sod was replaced, and stood at the northern boundary stone with her grandfather's initials in it, and looked at the field that had given the mineral seam, and taken back its drainage, and was still the East Field, still hers, still carrying the measure of 40 years of honest work in its soil. She kept the holding, the Duke kept the estate, and the East Field kept its flock, and the North Quarter, relieved of its extra burden, gave back a little more each year, as ground does when it has been treated fairly. There was a morning in the second year, in the early spring, when she stood at the south gate of the East Field and watched the light come across it, the long, even slope of it, the good drainage carrying the night's rain away in the clean channels her grandfather had cut. And she thought about the September letter and what it had nearly cost, and about the October night and what had come in from the rain. She thought about her mother's teaching, a hungry thing at the gate, you open the door. She had opened the door without calculation, because calculation was not how the teaching worked. The teaching was not about return. It was about the kind of person you were when no one was watching and nothing was certain, and the weather was doing what the Northumberland weather does, which is whatever it likes. That was the whole of it, in the end. She had been the person her mother had made her, in a kitchen, on a rainy night, and the ground had given back the measure of it. Not because virtue is rewarded in any simple accounting, not because opening the door earns a duke, but because honesty, practiced steadily and without expectation, becomes the thing you are, and the thing you are is the thing you have, and what you have, tended faithfully, gives back more than you put in. That is what Northumberland ground knows. That is what the Eastfield knew. Tell us in the comments what this story made you think of, and where in the world you are watching from. And if this found you at the right moment, share it with someone who needs to hear that what you do when nothing is certain is the truest thing about you. Until next time, take care.